In 1842, there was this 5-year-old boy in England, and he spent like 14 hours a day just hauling coal in total darkness deep underground.
Just incredibly bleak.
Yeah, totally bleak.
Yeah.
And then I want you to fast forward to this exact moment right now. A single algorithmic trading program is generating billions of dollars in wealth in, milliseconds.
Right.
And it's housed in a server farm that's cooled by glacial water. So you have to ask, what connects those two realities?
It's a massive gap.
Exactly. How do you get from a shivering child in a Victorian mine to a server farm executing microtransactions?
Well, the answer is that both of them are operating under the exact same economic engine. It's just constantly mutating.
Right. And whether you're, prepping for a massive boardroom presentation today, or you're literally just standing in line paying for groceries.
Or scrolling through the news on your phone.
Yeah, just trying to make sense of the world. You are navigating this single overarching system. It's basically the invisible architecture of your daily life. We're talking about capitalism.
It really is the economic water we swim in. I mean, it dictates how goods are produced, how resources are allocated, how wealth is distributed, and fundamentally how we make decisions as a society.
Yeah.
But because it's so omnipresent, we rarely actually pause to look at its structural integrity. We treat it like the weather, like something that just happens to us.
Right, like it's just a natural phenomenon.
Yeah.
But it's not.
Yeah.
It's an engineered system with a specific history and specific rules.
Exactly.
So our mission for this deep dive is to execute a really thorough historical exploration into what is undoubtedly the most successful and honestly the most debated economic system in human history.
We want to uncover where it actually came from, look under the hood, so to speak.
Right. We want to understand the mechanics. We're going to look at its staggering achievements, creating material prosperity, pulling billions out of poverty. But we are also going to look straight at its catastrophic crises and the human cost it has extracted.
But before we jump into those mechanics, we really need to lay down the parameters for our analysis today.
Yeah, that's crucial.
Because this is a historical and economic exploration. We are looking at structural realities. We are not engaging in a partisan debate.
No, not at all. We're not here to act as cheerleaders for the free market. And we aren't here to act as revolutionaries trying to tear it down either.
Right. The historical record we're drawing from, it details instances of phenomenal human ingenuity, like innovations that literally doubled human life expectancy.
It's wild to think about.
It is, but it also details periods of brutal, systematic exploitation. And the history of capitalism requires holding two opposing ideas in your head at the exact same time.
Its capacity for immense creation and its capacity for immense destruction.
Precisely. So we're going to impartially report on the historical events and the economic theories provided in our sources. We are not endorsing any particular ideology. Our goal is just to help you understand the mechanics and the history so you can draw your own conclusions.
Okay, so let's start at square one. Because the word capitalism gets thrown around constantly in political discourse, usually as a weapon, honestly.
Oh, absolutely.
It's become this catch-all term for literally anything people either love or hate about the modern world. But looking at the sources, it seems like capitalism isn't just, when people buy and sell things.
Right. It's not just trade.
Yeah. It's an architecture built on 4 very specific pillars.
And it requires all 4 of those pillars operating simultaneously to function. If you remove even one, you're looking at a different economic system entirely.
So looking at the sources, the first non-negotiable rule is private ownership, which, sounds incredibly basic to a modern ear. Like, of course people own things.
Sure.
But the sources are making a very specific distinction about what is owned. Right? Like we aren't talking about owning your toothbrush or your shoes.
Yeah, we are talking about private ownership of the means of production.
The means of production.
Right. The physical and abstract tools required to generate wealth. So historically, this meant land and factories. Today, it means heavy equipment, server farms, intellectual property, data networks.
Just like that.
Exactly. In a capitalist system, these are owned by private individuals or corporate entities. They are not owned by the state, and they are not held communally by society at large.
And the downstream effect of that is massive. Because for a huge chunk of human history, that just wasn't the case. Like if you go back to the Middle Ages, the land was ultimately held by the monarch or by the church.
Right. You didn't hold a deed to it.
No, you lived on it by the grace of a sovereign. So private ownership means you actually have a legally defensible title to the wealth-generating asset itself.
Yes. But ownership alone isn't enough. Because a feudal lord owned the land, but we don't call that capitalism.
Right. So what is the second mechanism?
The second pillar is market exchange. Goods, services, and resources are distributed primarily through voluntary exchange in markets. And crucially, the prices are determined by supply and demand.
Okay, let's dig into the mechanics of that.
Mm.
Because humans have always right. I could trade you a cow for a plow in the year 800.
Sure, but that's barter.
Exactly. The sources suggest a market system does something far more complex with information.
It does. A true market system acts as a decentralized information processing network. Prices aren't just, numbers on a tag, they are signals.
Signals.
Right. So if a freeze destroys half the orange crop in Florida, the price of oranges goes up.
Because they're scarce.
Exactly. And that high price signals to consumers to buy fewer oranges. But it also signals to farmers in California to plant more orange trees because the profit margin is suddenly much higher.
And all of this happens without a central planning committee. There's no royal decree telling anyone what to do.
Right, the market mechanism coordinates the behavior of millions of self-interested individuals automatically.
Which is wild.
Yeah.
And that brings us to the third pillar. And this is the one that really separates capitalism from anything that came before it. Wage labor.
Yes.
Because in this system, the vast majority of people do not own the means of production. They don't own the factory or the server farm.
No, they don't. And because they don't own the wealth-generating assets, they have to sell the only thing they do own. Their time, their skills, and their physical labor.
Right.
They sell it in a market to the people who do own the capital in exchange for a wage. They aren't working to consume what they personally produce. Like, you don't eat the software you code.
Or drive the car you assemble on the line.
Exactly. And they aren't working as part of a feudal obligation to a lord either. They are free agents negotiating a price for their labor.
Okay, we'll put a pin in the word free for a moment.
Yeah.
Because the historical origins of that are incredibly dark, and we will definitely get there.
We will.
But the final piece of the puzzle, Pillar 4, is the engine that drives the whole machine. Capital accumulation.
Right. Capital accumulation is basically the metabolic process of the system. Profit isn't generated merely to be consumed. A capitalist doesn't make $1 million just to buy $1 million worth of lavish feasts and sit idle.
Right. They don't just put it in a giant vault and swim in it.
No. Profit is systematically reinvested to generate more capital. It creates a self-expanding perpetual loop of growth.
If we think about this like an evolutionary biological system, an organism doesn't just gather nutrients to survive the day, right?
Yeah.
It gathers nutrients to grow larger, to outcompete other organisms, and to replicate.
That's a great way to look at it.
Like, if you own a bakery and you make a profit, you don't just put the cash in your mattress. You use the profit to buy a second industrial oven.
Right.
And then that second oven doubles your output, which doubles your profit, which allows you to buy 3 more ovens, and eventually you buy out the baker across the street. The system mandates expansion. If you stand still, you die.
That evolutionary pressure is the primary driver of economic growth, and it's also the source of its inherent instability. But it is vital for you to understand that these 4 features, private ownership, markets, wage labor, and accumulation, they don't exist in a rigid binary.
They exist on a spectrum.
A vast spectrum of application, yes.
Meaning, we can tune the dials on these pillars differently depending on the society.
Precisely. So on one end of the spectrum, you have laissez-faire capitalism. This is a theoretical ideal where the government provides a legal framework to enforce contracts, but otherwise they stay entirely out of the market. Minimal taxes, minimal regulation.
Just let the machine run.
Exactly. But on the other end, you have the social democracies we see in places like the Nordic countries. They still rely entirely on private ownership and market exchange to generate wealth, but the state heavily taxes that accumulated capital and intervenes in the wage labor market to provide robust social safety nets.
So both are fundamentally capitalist, but they prioritize completely different outcomes.
Right.
Okay, so if this specific combination of private ownership, market exchange, wage labor, and perpetual accumulation is the operating system of the modern world, how did humanity function before we installed this software?
It was a very different world.
Let's go back to the 13th century. What does economic life actually look like for the average person before capitalism?
Honestly, it would be almost unrecognizable to us. We have this terrible habit of projecting our modern market mentality backward onto history, assuming people have always been trying to maximize their individual financial returns.
Right, the whole hustle culture mindset.
Yeah, but for the vast majority of human history, economic life was organized around subsistence, custom, and strict social hierarchy.
Okay, paint that picture for us. Say I'm a peasant living in France in the year 1250.
Okay, so you are living in a system of subsistence agriculture and feudal obligation. You farm a plot of land that belongs to a lord, and you are tied to that land.
I can't just move.
No, you cannot. You don't decide what to plant based on what will fetch the highest price at a regional market.
Yeah,
You plant what your family literally needs to survive the winter.
right.
You owe a physical portion of your crop and a portion of your physical labor to the lord of the manor.
Hmm.
You owe another portion to the church as a tithe. The concept of profit is entirely alien to you. Your whole goal is survival and fulfilling your traditional obligations.
Man. And what if I'm not a peasant? What if I live in a city and make shoes?
Well, if you are an artisan, your economic life is dictated by a guild.
A guild?
Right. The guild is a highly regulated association that controls every single aspect of your trade. It dictates how many pairs of shoes you can make, exactly what materials you must use, what price you're allowed to charge, and who is even allowed to become an apprentice.
So there is zero free market competition.
Zero. If you invent a faster way to make shoes and try to undercut the other shoemakers to steal their customers, the guild will literally shut you down. Economic life was governed by religious morals, like the church's ban on usury, charging interest, and by social stability, not by market efficiency.
The very idea of buying a stranger's labor for a wage, using it to produce a massive surplus of goods, selling those goods to people you've never met at a profit, and using that profit to buy more labor. I mean, it would have seemed completely bizarre and honestly deeply immoral to the pre-capitalist mind.
It really would have.
So how do we break out of that rigid, static world? Where do the first cracks in the feudal system appear?
The first major cracks appear in the Italian city-states of the 13th and 14th centuries, places like Florence, Venice, and Genoa.
Okay, the merchants.
Right. These cities were uniquely positioned geographically to dominate trade between Europe and the East.
So we start seeing individuals who are making their wealth not from owning land and taxing peasants, but from moving goods, buying silk and spices in the Levant and selling them at a markup in Europe.
And as this long-distance trade grew, it required something entirely new: complex financial infrastructure.
Because moving physical chests of gold across bandit-infested Europe or pirate-filled seas was incredibly risky and inefficient, right?
Exactly. So the Italian merchants invented, or at least standardized, the commercial practices that would become the scaffolding of capitalism.
And the sources place a massive emphasis on one specific invention here: double-entry bookkeeping, which on the surface sounds like the most tedious accounting trivia imaginable.
It sounds incredibly dry.
Right. But the sources treat it like the invention of the microchip. Why is a ledger so revolutionary?
Because of how it mathematically structures reality. Before double-entry bookkeeping, a merchant might just keep a list of what they bought and what they sold. It was essentially a diary.
Just a running tally.
Right. But double-entry bookkeeping requires that every single transaction be recorded in two separate places, as a debit in one account and a credit in another.
So if I buy a ship for 1,000 gold coins, I record a decrease in my cash account and a simultaneous increase in my asset account.
Yes. And the profound magic of this is that the entire ledger must perfectly balance at the end of the day.
And if it doesn't?
If it doesn't balance, you instantly know there is an error or fraud. This mechanism allows a merchant sitting in a palazzo in Venice to accurately track immensely complex networks of assets, liabilities, inventory, and profits across dozens of ships and hundreds of agents located all over the known world. It creates a mathematical abstraction of wealth. Without it, you cannot manage capital accumulation at scale. It really is the DNA of corporate growth.
That is fascinating. And alongside that, they develop letters of credit, which are essentially the first traveler's checks, so you can deposit gold in Florence and withdraw it in Paris, and early forms of maritime insurance to hedge the immense risk of shipwrecks.
Exactly.
So the Italians build the financial scaffolding. But we still don't have capitalism. We just have very sophisticated merchants. The vast majority of the European population is still tied to the land in a feudal system. We don't have that third pillar, right? A massive pool of wage laborers.
We don't. And creating that labor pool required one of the most violent, traumatic social transformations in human history.
This is where things get really dark.
Yeah. To get industrial capitalism, you need a free labor market. You need millions of people who are separated from the means of producing their own food, leaving them with absolutely no choice but to sell their labor. And this brings us to the enclosure movement in England.
This was a deeply visceral realization for me in the sources, because we often talk about the free market as if it just naturally evolved from human nature.
People assume it was just organic.
Yeah, but The sources show that the free labor market was intentionally legally engineered through the enclosure movement. Walk us through how this actually happened.
So, for centuries in England, vast tracts of land were considered commons. While the local lord may have technically owned the estate, custom and tradition dictated that the peasant communities had permanent rights to use the common land.
So they can just use it whenever.
Yeah, they could graze their sheep, forage for firewood, plant small subsistence gardens. This commons system was the safety net that kept the peasantry alive.
It was literally the basis of their survival.
But beginning around the 15th century and accelerating wildly through the 18th century, the global market for wool became incredibly profitable.
Okay.
The aristocracy and the large landowners looked at these common pastures and realized they could make a fortune if they cleared the peasants out and filled the land with massive flocks of sheep.
Wait, so they just took it? They just kicked people off land they had lived on for generations?
They did. They utilized their control of Parliament to pass a series of enclosure acts. They legally redefined property rights. They literally put up fences and hedges, enclosing the commons and turning shared resources into the strictly private commercial property.
I mean, just imagine the psychological and physical shock of that. Your family has lived in a village for 400 years. You survive because you can graze your cow on the pasture. And suddenly a piece of paper from London arrives, a fence goes up, and if you let your cow eat the grass, you are a criminal trespassing on private property.
It was devastating.
The sheer scale of the dispossession is staggering. Millions of people were systematically stripped of their ability to feed themselves.
And the downstream consequence of that dispossession is the creation of the modern labor force. Economists refer to this as the creation of a free labor market.
And this is where the terminology feels so violently ironic. The labor market was only free because the population was forcibly starved off their land.
Right. They were legally free. They were no longer serfs legally bound to a lord.
But they were economically compelled. They were free in the same way you are free to jump out of a burning building.
That's a brutal way to put it, but yes.
Without land, without the commons, the only asset you have left is your physical body and your time. You must sell your labor to an employer, or you will literally starve to death.
That structural compulsion is the dark heart of the transition. It created a massive, desperate, mobile population that migrated into the growing towns and cities looking for any wage they could find. This provided the human fuel that the coming Industrial Revolution would require.
Okay, so we have the financial accounting and banking from the Italians.
Yeah.
We have the desperate, dispossessed labor pool from the English enclosures. But we're still missing the institutional vehicle, right? How do we pool enough money to build a global system?
For that, we shift our focus to the Dutch in the early 17th century and the invention of the first megacorporation.
Okay, the Dutch East India Company.
Yes. In 1602, the Dutch government chartered the VOC, the Dutch East India Company, and it represented a quantum leap in the structure of capitalism. It was the first publicly traded joint stock company.
Let's explain the mechanics of a joint stock company, because it solves a massive bottleneck in human ambition.
It really does.
Before this, if I wanted to fund an expedition to sail to Indonesia to buy spices, I needed to be insanely wealthy. I had to buy the ship, hire the crew, and buy the provisions myself. And if that ship hit a reef and sank,
We lost everything.
right, my entire family fortune was gone in an afternoon. The risk was completely concentrated.
Which heavily restricted the scale of global trade. No one wanted to take that risk. But the Dutch East India Company solved this by fractionalizing the ownership.
Fractionalizing it.
Instead of one person fronting the money, anyone in Amsterdam could buy a share of the company. A baker, a blacksmith, a wealthy merchant, they could all pool their capital together.
Oh, I see.
So if the company funded 10 ships and one sank, nobody was ruined. The risk was distributed across thousands of investors.
And if the other 9 ships came back full of nutmeg and pepper, everyone got a proportional cut of the massive profits. A dividend.
Exactly. It allowed society to pool capital on a scale that only kings had previously managed.
That's incredible.
Furthermore, it created a secondary market. If you bought a share in the VOC, you didn't have to wait 3 years for the ships to return to get your money back. You could sell your piece of paper, your share, to someone else at the Amsterdam Stock Exchange.
Just trade it right then and there.
Right. But the most profound innovation was the legal structure of the corporation itself. The Dutch East India Company was granted a legal identity entirely separate from the people who owned it.
Meaning the company could outlast any single human lifespan. It became like an immortal, abstract machine.
An immortal machine whose sole legally mandated purpose was the relentless accumulation of capital. And because of this structure, the VOC became a state unto itself. It possessed its own massive naval fleets, it waged wars, it coined its own money, and it established brutal colonial monopolies in Asia.
It basically proved that a corporation could project power and organize resources on a global scale.
Yes.
So by the mid-1700s, all the pieces of the capitalist architecture are on the board. You have the corporate structure capable of pooling infinite capital and distributing risk. You have double-entry bookkeeping to track and optimize every fraction of a penny. You have a massive landless population in England, desperate for any kind of wage work. All the dry kindling is stacked. What happens when you throw a technological spark into that specific pile of kindling?
You ignite the Industrial Revolution, and capitalism ceases to be just a commercial trading system for merchants and becomes the dominant force capable of reshaping the physical environment of the planet.
We are looking at Britain, roughly starting in the 1760s.
The technological breakthroughs are famous, James Watt's perfection of the steam engine, the mechanization of textile spinning with the water frame and the spinning jenny,
Right.
the development of new iron smelting techniques using coal, and eventually the railways.
But the sources are insistent on a crucial distinction here. It wasn't just that some clever inventors made some neat machines. Like, the Romans understood the basic principles of steam power, right? They used it to make toys spin. The Chinese had incredibly advanced metallurgy for centuries. The technology alone didn't change the world.
No, it didn't.
What changed the world was the fact that the technology was plugged into the incentive structure of capitalism.
That is the key. The synthesis of the machine and the market is what creates the explosion. If you operate within a system of private ownership, wage labor, and fierce market competition, you are possessed by an insatiable hunger for productive efficiency.
Right, because you have to be.
Exactly. If you own a textile mill and a new steam-powered loom is invented that allows one worker to produce the same amount of cloth as 50 hand weavers, you are economically compelled to buy that machine.
Because if I don't buy the machine, the mill owner in the next town over will. He will produce cloth 50 times faster and vastly cheaper than I can. He will lower his prices, steal all my customers, and drive me into bankruptcy. The market mechanism forces me to adopt the new technology, optimize my labor, and accumulate more capital just to survive.
And the macroeconomic results of that dynamic were unprecedented in the history of our species. Between 1760 and the end of the 19th century, the productive capacity of human society broke free from the natural limits of human and animal muscle power.
We tapped into ancient sunlight stored in coal.
Exactly, and economic output grew by a factor that defies historical comparison.
We saw a genuine productivity miracle. For the first time ever, the concept of permanent economic growth became a reality. The sheer volume of material goods, clothing, tools, building materials, food, it just expanded exponentially.
It did. And over the long run, this system is what eventually pulled massive segments of the population out of agrarian poverty, driving the long, steady upward trend in global life expectancy.
Right, the material possibilities of human existence were fundamentally, permanently altered. But we must immediately address the short-term realities of this transition, because the initial accumulation of this wealth was extracted at a horrific human cost.
It was, and we cannot gloss over this.
No, we have to look at the visceral, jarring details from the sources, because the early industrial prosperity was quite literally built on the broken bodies of the wage laborers. This wasn't a smooth transition to modernity. It was a dystopian nightmare for the people living through it.
The conditions in the early factories and coal mines of 18th and 19th century Britain are almost incomprehensible to a modern audience.
Yeah.
Because the labor pool was completely desperate, and because there was absolutely no state regulation, capital owners could dictate whatever terms they wanted. We are talking about working days that routinely lasted 14 to 16 hours, 6 days a week, in environments filled with deafening noise, toxic dust, and dangerous, unshielded machinery.
The sources specifically focus on the intensive exploitation of children here, because a machine doesn't require the physical strength of an adult man to operate. Factory owners realized they could hire women and children for a fraction of the wages.
A fraction. We are talking about children as young as 5 or 6 years old.
5 or 6.
In the textile mills, young children were used as scavengers, forced to crawl underneath the massive, moving, steam-powered looms to sweep up loose cotton. This frequently resulted in horrific amputations or death.
Oh my God.
And in the coal mines, small children were employed as trappers, sitting in absolute pitch blackness for 14 hours a day to open and close ventilation doors.
Think about a 5-year-old you know today, a child who's just learning to read. Now imagine sending them into a collapsing gas-filled tunnel for 14 hours. So a joint stock company in London can increase its quarterly dividend by a fraction of a percent.
That's sickening.
The cruelty is staggering. And when those workers left the factories, the urban environments they returned to were lethal.
They really were. The rapid urbanization driven by the factory system completely outpaced any civil infrastructure. Cities like Manchester exploded in population without adequate housing, clean water, or sanitation.
People were just packed in.
Families were packed into damp cellars. Diseases like cholera and tuberculosis ran rampant. The statistical reality is grim. During the early decades of the Industrial Revolution, the mortality rates and life expectancy in these booming industrial cities actually dropped below the levels of the pre-industrial rural areas those people had been forced to leave.
So the overall wealth of the nation is skyrocketing. The ledgers are balancing, the steam engines are doing miracles, the aristocrats and factory owners are building unimaginable fortunes. But the people actually operating the machines, the wage laborers, are living in a grinding, lethal state of poverty.
Okay.
Which brings us to a critical turning point. Because a system built on the backs of 5-year-old coal miners is fundamentally unstable. It was bound to trigger a massive societal immune response. You cannot sustain that level of brutal, visible inequality and exploitation without someone eventually looking at the architecture of the system and saying, wait a minute. This isn't a natural law. This entire system is rigged.
And the most significant, systematic, and historically consequential voice to say exactly that belonged to a German philosopher and economist named Karl Marx.
Right.
Along with his collaborator Friedrich Engels, Marx spent decades analyzing the inner workings of this new industrial world, eventually producing the intellectual framework that would challenge capitalism for the next century and a half.
We need to unpack the Marxist critique carefully. And again, our goal is to impartially explain the historical theories that shape the world. We're just looking at the theory.
Of course.
So, Marx spends years sitting in the reading room of the British Museum, obsessively studying capitalist economics, and in 1867, he publishes his masterwork, Capital.
Whoa.
What is his central argument about how this engine actually functions?
Marx's central realization was that the brutality of early industrial capitalism wasn't just an incidental flaw. It wasn't caused by a few bad apples or uniquely cruel factory owners. He argued that exploitation was an inherent structural requirement of the system.
It was baked in.
It was a mathematical necessity driven by what he called surplus value.
Surplus value. This is the linchpin of his entire theory. Let's break down the mechanics of surplus value with a concrete example.
Sure. Marx looked at the relationship between the two new classes created by capitalism, the capital owners, whom he called the bourgeoisie, and the wage workers, the proletariat.
Okay.
He argued that the only thing that actually creates new value in the world is human labor. A pile of wood and a pile of tools are completely useless until a human applies their labor to them.
So let's say I am a wage laborer in a 19th century furniture factory. I spend 10 hours a day building a highly crafted wooden chair. The factory owner takes that chair and sells it at the market for $100.
Exactly. Now, the factory owner has to cover his costs. Let's say he pays $30 for the raw wood, the glue, and the wear and tear on the saws. That leaves $70.
Okay.
He then pays you, the worker, a daily wage of $20.
Which leaves $50 left over. The profit.
And Marx asks the fundamental question, where did that $50 come from? It didn't magically appear from the wood, it came from your labor. You infused $70 worth of new value into those raw materials, but you were only paid $20.
Wow. Okay.
The remaining $50 is the surplus value, and the factory owner, simply by virtue of owning the legal title to the factory and the tools, gets to pocket that $50.
He expropriates the surplus value that I created.
Yes. Marx argued that you are essentially working for free for a large portion of your day. The owner is extracting unpaid labor from you. And because of the coercive nature of the labor market, because you don't own any tools yourself and will starve if you don't work, you are forced to accept this unequal exchange.
So in Marx's view, capital accumulation is nothing more than the hoarded, crystallized form of unpaid human labor.
Exactly.
So capitalism functions essentially like a vampire. It's a dead mechanism that can only survive and expand by constantly sucking the living surplus value out of the laboring class.
That is precisely the metaphor Marx used, actually. And because he believed this contradiction was structural, he argued the system was ultimately doomed to destroy itself.
Doomed.
He predicted that the fierce competition between capitalists would force them to constantly lower wages and replace workers with machines to maintain their profit margins. This would lead to wealth becoming concentrated in fewer and fewer hands, while the working class sank into deeper misery.
And this creates a fatal flaw in the machinery, right? Because if you squeeze the workers so hard that they're living in poverty, who is going to buy the millions of chairs the factories are producing?
Exactly. Marx identified this as the crisis of overproduction. The system produces a massive abundance of goods, but simultaneously impoverishes the very consumers needed to buy them.
It's catch-22.
He believed these crises would become increasingly severe until finally the proletariat would realize their collective power, rise up in a revolutionary rupture, overthrow the bourgeoisie, abolish private property, and seize the means of production for themselves.
Okay, but spoiler alert for the history of the 19th and 20th centuries, that massive systemic collapse and revolution didn't happen in the advanced industrial economies.
It did not.
Marx expected the revolution to happen in the most industrialized places like Britain or Germany or the United States. So if the system was as brutal as we described, and if Marx's critique of the fundamental friction between capital and labor was accurate, why didn't the whole thing explode? Why did capitalism survive?
Capitalism survived because it proved to be remarkably, almost biologically, adaptable. When faced with the very real threat of systemic collapse, the system mutated.
It changed.
Yes. Instead of a winner-take-all revolutionary war, what actually played out across the late 19th and mid-20th centuries was a complex, bloody, decades-long negotiation between capital and labor.
And we really need to emphasize the word bloody here, because the reforms that saved the system were not handed down voluntarily. We see the rise of the labor movement. Working people realized that individually they were powerless against a massive corporation, but collectively they could stop the machinery of production entirely.
The formation of trade unions was initially treated as a criminal conspiracy. Governments, acting largely in the interests of capital owners, deployed police, private militias, and the military to physically crush strikes and break up labor organizations.
People were beaten, imprisoned, and murdered for demanding better conditions.
They were.
Which is a reality that often gets sterilized in our history books. When you enjoy your 2-day weekend, when you leave work after 8 hours, when you look at laws banning child labor or ensuring workplace safety, it is vital to remember that these were not gifts from benevolent factory owners who suddenly grew a conscience.
Definitely not.
They were concessions forced out of the system through intense political pressure, organized strikes, and the looming, terrifying specter of socialist revolution hanging over Europe.
The capital-owning class and the governments that supported them eventually realized that if they didn't bend, the system would break entirely. They had to give up a fraction of their wealth and control to preserve the overall architecture of private property and market exchange.
And this intense negotiation leads to the invention of the welfare state. It starts in Germany in the 1880s with Otto von Bismarck, who was a staunch conservative, not a socialist, instituting the first public health insurance and old age pensions, specifically to undercut the appeal of radical socialism among the working class.
The welfare state became a critical mechanism to modify the brutal outcomes of the market. It didn't change the core engine. The means of production remained in private hands, and goods were still distributed via market exchange. But it used the power of the state to tax some of the accumulated capital and redistribute it.
It created public health care, public education, unemployment insurance, and workplace safety regulations. It established a floor below which citizens were not allowed to fall.
Yes.
Let's use an analogy here. Think of capitalism as a tremendously powerful, incredibly fast vehicle. In the early Industrial Revolution, that vehicle had no shock absorbers, no seatbelts, and no brakes. It was rocketing forward, generating massive speed and wealth. But the passengers inside, the workers, were being violently thrown around, injured, and crushed by every bump in the road.
That's a very vivid image.
So what the labor movement and the creation of the welfare state did was force the engineers to install heavy-duty shock absorbers. They added a suspension system. They didn't change the engine. It's still a capitalist engine burning the fuel of profit and wage labor, but they mitigated the violence of the ride. They stopped the inherent instability of the free market from literally destroying society.
That is an excellent way to conceptualize the grand compromise of the mid-20th century. Capital got to keep accumulating, preserving the dynamism of the market, but labor secured a larger, guaranteed share of the wealth and protection from the worst extremes of poverty and exploitation.
But as we transition into the 20th century, we discover a terrifying reality about this economic vehicle. Sometimes, even with the best shock absorbers installed, the engine completely stalls out. The machinery seizes up entirely.
Which brings us to the Great Depression, the single most severe economic crisis in the history of the capitalist system, and the event that completely shattered how economists and the public understood how markets functioned.
We really need to pause and absorb the sheer scale of the devastation triggered by the stock market crash of 1929, because the statistics are staggering. By 1933, the economic output of the United States had been cut in half. Unemployment hit 25%.
1 in 4 people.
1 in 4 willing, able-bodied workers could not find a job to feed their families. Thousands of banks collapsed, literally vanishing overnight and wiping out the life savings of millions of ordinary people. The global economy was in an absolute freefall.
And what made the Great Depression so terrifying wasn't just the economic pain, it was the intellectual crisis that accompanied it. The mainstream economic theory of the time, the classical laissez-faire approach, had absolutely no solution to offer.
Because according to classical theory, this wasn't supposed to be possible, right? The prevailing belief was that markets are inherently magically self-correcting.
Exactly. Classical economists believed that a depression was just a natural, temporary imbalance. Their advice to governments was essentially do nothing, liquidate the bad debt, balance the national budget, and wait.
Just wait it out.
They theorized that as unemployment rose, wages would drop. Once wages dropped low enough, it would become highly profitable for businesses to hire people again. The market would naturally clear itself and return to full employment.
But they waited. And they waited. And the market didn't clear. It just kept getting worse. People were starving in the streets while factories sat empty and farms let their crops rot. The self-correcting mechanism was fundamentally broken.
And into this catastrophic intellectual void steps a British economist named John Maynard Keynes. In 1936, he publishes a book called The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, and it fundamentally rewrites the operating rules of capitalism.
Let's break down the Keynesian realization. What did Keynes see about the machinery of capitalism that the classical economists missed?
Keynes realized that the classical economists were wrong about how markets correct themselves. He argued that an economy could absolutely get stuck in a trap, a terrible, persistent equilibrium of low output and mass unemployment. And it all came down to aggregate demand.
Aggregate demand,
Yeah.
which is basically the total amount of spending in the economy.
Right.
Walk us through the mechanism of this trap.
Think about the psychological reality of a depression. If unemployment is soaring, everyone is terrified of losing their job. What do you do when you are terrified of losing your income? You stop spending money, you hoard your cash.
Makes sense on an individual level.
But one person's spending is another person's income. Because millions of people stop buying new clothes or cars, the businesses that make those things lose revenue. Because they lose revenue, they fire more workers. Those newly fired workers stop spending completely, which causes more businesses to fail, leading to more layoffs. It is a vicious, self-reinforcing downward spiral.
It's what economists call the paradox of thrift. What makes total sense for me to do individually, saving my money during a crisis, literally destroys the entire economy if everyone does it at the exact same time. The engine is starved of fuel.
Exactly.
So if the private market is caught in this death spiral, what was Keynes' solution? How do you restart a stalled engine?
Keynes argued that there is only one entity large enough and powerful enough to break the cycle: the government. He argued that in a severe downturn, the government must step in and become the spender of last resort.
Meaning the government shouldn't balance its budget and tighten its belt like a household would?
Precisely the opposite. Keynes argued the government should deliberately run a massive deficit. It should borrow money and spend it directly into the economy, build highways, build dams, construct schools, hire people to plant trees in national parks. The specific project almost doesn't matter as long as it puts a paycheck into the hands of unemployed workers.
Because once those workers have a paycheck, they go out and buy groceries and shoes. The grocer and the shoemaker suddenly have revenue, so they hire people to meet the new demand. The government spending creates a multiplier effect that jumpstarts the private market.
And this Keynesian revolution completely transformed how the capitalist world operated after World War II. Governments everywhere abandoned the idea that markets should be left entirely alone. They embraced active macroeconomic management, using government spending, taxation, and central bank interest rates to smooth out the violent boom and bust cycles of the free market.
And the results were astonishing. The sources point out that this post-war consensus ushered in what economic historians call the golden age of capitalism, roughly spanning from 1945 to 1973.
It was a period of managed capitalism. The state, large corporations, and powerful labor unions worked in a heavily negotiated, relatively stable tandem.
And I really marvel at this era when reading the sources because it represents the closest capitalism has ever come to actually delivering on its ultimate theoretical promise of general, widespread prosperity. During this quarter-century, economic growth was phenomenal. Productivity was rising rapidly due to new technologies.
Oh, the boom time.
But crucially, and this is what separates it from today, wages were growing in lockstep with productivity.
Right, a factory worker's output doubled and their paycheck doubled along with it.
Exactly. Inequality actually fell significantly. The middle class exploded in size and wealth. The welfare state expanded to provide immense security. You could graduate from high school, work a unionized manufacturing job, own a suburban home, buy a car, and send your kids to college on a single income. It felt like they had finally tamed the beast.
It did feel that way. But as with every chapter in this history, the equilibrium was temporary, the capitalist engine is highly sensitive to external shocks, and it eventually mutates to overcome its constraints.
Which brings us to the inevitable transition. Because if the Keynesian Golden Age was so incredibly successful, if wages were rising, inequality was low, and the middle class was thriving, why on earth did we abandon that model?
We abandoned it because, in the 1970s, the Keynesian playbook catastrophically stopped working. The global economy was hit by a series of massive external shocks, most notably the OPEC oil embargoes, which quadrupled the price of energy overnight.
Wow, quadrupled.
And this triggered a new economic phenomenon that completely baffled the experts: stagflation.
Stagflation. This is a confusing concept, but it is vital for understanding why our modern economy looks the way it does. What exactly broke in the 1970s?
Stagflation is the simultaneous occurrence of high inflation, where prices are rising rapidly out of control, and high unemployment, meaning the economy is stagnant and people are losing jobs.
And why is that a paradox?
Because, according to the Keynesian models of the time, those two things were supposed to operate like a seesaw. If the economy was running too hot, you got inflation, but unemployment was low. If the economy was in recession, unemployment was high, but prices would drop.
They weren't supposed to happen together.
Right. Having both soaring inflation and soaring unemployment at the exact same time was structurally impossible, according to their theories. It was like watching a car engine violently overheat while the car itself is rolling backward down a hill.
So the Keynesian mechanics are staring at the dashboard, completely paralyzed. If they increase government spending to create jobs, they pour gasoline on the inflation fire, and prices spiral further out of control. If they cut spending and raise interest rates to kill inflation, they crush the economy and throw millions more people out of work. They literally didn't have a lever to pull.
Precisely. The Keynesian consensus lost its intellectual credibility, and into this vacuum stepped a very different set of ideas, championed by economists like Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman, emerging from the Chicago School of Economics.
The birth of the neoliberal era.
Yes. And again, as we review these ideas, we're just reporting on the historical shift. These economists looked at the stagflation of the 1970s and argued that the problem wasn't a lack of government intervention. They argued that government intervention was the problem.
So they flipped the script completely.
They believed that decades of heavy regulation, high taxes on the wealthy, the expansion of the welfare state, and the immense power of labor unions had made the economy sluggish, rigid, and wildly inefficient.
Their philosophy was a return to first principles. They argued that a free, unregulated market is the ultimate flawless information processor. No government bureaucrat can ever allocate resources as efficiently as the price mechanism of the free market.
Therefore, their solution to the crisis of the 1970s was a radical restructuring of the capitalist system. They argued we needed to unleash capital from the constraints of the state, lower taxes, especially on corporations and high earners, to stimulate investment, deregulate the financial industry and corporate sectors, privatize state-owned enterprises,
and above all, crush the power of organized labor, which they viewed as a monopolistic distortion of the free market for wages.
Right, and this wasn't just an academic debate in university halls. This becomes the dominant political and economic reality of the late 20th century. In the 1980s, you have leaders like Margaret Thatcher in the UK and Ronald Reagan in the US fully embracing this neoliberal operating system.
And through international institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, these policies of privatization, deregulation, and free trade are exported globally.
The structural changes implemented between 1980 and the early 2000s fundamentally re-engineered the global economy. Capital became hypermobile. Restrictions on moving money across borders were lifted. Manufacturing in the advanced economies of the US and Western Europe was increasingly outsourced, moved to developing nations where labor was vastly cheaper and environmental regulations were non-existent.
Simultaneously, the financial sector, banking, investment, stock trading, derivatives, began to balloon in size, becoming the dominant driver of economic growth in the West.
It completely changed the landscape.
Okay, so we've been running this neoliberal, hyper-globalized version of capitalism for a few decades now. Let's look at the historical data and weigh the results, because the sources present an incredibly complex dual reality that we have to grapple with. On one hand, if you zoom out and look at the macro global level, the results look like an absolute miracle.
They do. The integration of massive, previously closed developing economies, most notably China and India, into the global capitalist market resulted in the greatest reduction of human poverty in the history of the world.
That's huge.
By outsourcing manufacturing and opening global supply chains, hundreds of millions of people were lifted out of extreme agrarian destitution and integrated into a growing global middle class. The sheer scale of wealth creation, the drop in global infant mortality, the rise in global literacy, these achievements are statistically undeniable.
But on the other hand, if you zoom in on the advanced industrialized democracies that champion these policies, places like the United States and the UK, the picture is incredibly grim, because the shock absorbers that were installed during the Golden Age were systematically dismantled.
The social contract was essentially rewritten. In these advanced economies, inequality skyrocketed back to levels not seen since the Gilded Age of the 1920s.
The link between productivity and wages was completely severed. From the 1980s onward, workers continued to produce more and more value per hour, but their wages adjusted for inflation flatlined. Almost all the new wealth generated by this hyper-efficient global system was captured by the top tier of capital owners and corporate executives.
The secure, unionized middle class that defined mid-century was hollowed out. Industrial towns in the Rust Belt were decimated as factories moved overseas. Stable careers were replaced by precarious, gig economy jobs with no benefits. Economic anxiety and insecurity became the defining baseline emotion for millions of working-class people.
Which forces us to confront a really difficult question about the entire neoliberal project. Looking at the history, I have to ask you, was the hollowing out of the domestic middle class just an unfortunate, unforeseen accident of technological change and global integration? Or was it a feature of the system? Was it an accepted, unspoken trade-off where policymakers deliberately prioritize the massive returns of global capital owners over the stability and wages of domestic workers?
That remains the central, defining debate among economic historians and political scientists today. Proponents of the neoliberal order argue that the disruption was a painful but necessary transition to a more efficient, globally prosperous, tech-driven economy. Critics argue it was a deliberate class project, that the rules of the game were intentionally rewritten by the wealthy to dismantle the power of labor and capture a larger share of the surplus value.
Regardless of the underlying intent, the empirical reality was a deeply polarized, highly unequal economic landscape.
Yes.
And crucially, a landscape that was fundamentally unstable. Because the era of intense financial deregulation, the removal of the guardrails that had been put in place after the Great Depression, inevitably led the banking sector to create financial instruments that were so complex and so detached from actual physical value that they almost destroyed the entire global economy again.
Which moves us into Section 7 of our deep dive, the 2008 financial crisis.
Right. The system almost suffers a fatal heart attack. If the 1929 crash was a failure of the physical industrial economy, the sources paint 2008 as a failure of a hyper-financialized, abstract economy. And it all starts with the U.S. housing market.
For years, operating in a heavily deregulated environment, financial institutions had been furiously issuing subprime mortgages. These were massive home loans given to people who historically would never have qualified for them, often featuring explosive adjustable interest rates that the borrowers could not possibly afford in the long run.
But a bad mortgage here and there doesn't tank the global economy. If a bank makes a bad loan and a family defaults, that bank takes a loss.
Yeah.
How did a localized problem with housing debt become a contagion that nearly destroyed global capitalism?
It spread through financial alchemy. Wall Street investment banks took these thousands of highly risky, low-quality subprime mortgages and bundled them together into incredibly complex, opaque financial instruments known as mortgage-backed securities and collateralized debt obligations.
Okay, let's use a mechanical analogy here. Imagine Wall Street is building a massive skyscraper. The foundation is supposed to be solid, concrete, safe, reliable mortgages. But because they are greedy to build faster and taller, they start mixing massive amounts of cheap sand into the concrete. That sand represents the toxic, subprime mortgages.
And here is where the systemic failure occurs. The investment banks then hired credit rating agencies, the financial building inspectors, and paid them to stamp these weak, sand-filled concrete blocks with a AAA rating. They labeled them as the safest investments on Earth.
So the building inspectors are compromised. They tell the world the skyscraper is indestructible. And based on that guarantee, pension funds, governments, and banks all over the world start buying these blocks of toxic debt.
And the financial engineers went even further. They created derivatives known as credit default swaps. These were essentially unregulated insurance policies where investors could place massive bets on whether or not the skyscraper would fall down. The entire global financial system became interconnected in a dizzying web of leveraged bets, all resting on the foundational assumption that U.S. housing prices would continue to rise forever.
But in 2006 and 2007, the wind finally blew. The housing bubble burst, interest rates reset, and millions of people began to default on those subprime mortgages. The sand and the concrete began to crumble.
And suddenly, all those shiny AAA-rated securities were revealed to be completely toxic. And because the system was so globally interconnected and the derivatives were so complex, no bank knew which other banks were holding the bad debt. They didn't know who was solvent and who was bankrupt.
Trust, which is the actual currency of the financial system, evaporated overnight. The interbank lending market, the plumbing that allows the daily global economy to function, completely froze. The world's largest financial institutions were suddenly facing total annihilation.
And here is where we get to the government response, which is perhaps the most vital piece of historical context for understanding the fractured political reality we live in right this second. The banking system was on the brink of total collapse. What happened next?
The government stepped in with the most massive, unprecedented financial intervention in history. Trillions of dollars in bailouts.
The state enacted policies to inject taxpayer money directly into failing banks. Central banks slashed interest rates to near zero, and they instituted quantitative easing.
We hear that phrase all the time. Let's explain the actual mechanism of quantitative easing. What does it physically mean?
Normally, a central bank manages the economy by raising or lowering short-term interest rates. But in 2008, they lowered rates to zero, and the economy was still dying. They were out of traditional ammunition. So quantitative easing is when the central bank essentially creates vast sums of digital money out of thin air and uses it to buy up the toxic assets and government bonds held by the banks.
It is a mechanism to artificially pump massive amounts of liquidity into the financial system, forcibly lowering long-term interest rates to encourage lending and save the institutions from bankruptcy.
Exactly. And on a macroeconomic level, it worked. It stopped the panic and prevented a second Great Depression. The system technically stabilized.
But, and this is the contradiction that set the world on fire, the ideological hypocrisy was breathtaking. The titans of Wall Street, the ultimate proponents of the free market, had spent 30 years aggressively lobbying for deregulation. They preached the gospel of rugged individualism, claiming the market should be left alone to punish failure and reward success. But the moment their own reckless greed caused the system to implode, they ran to the state for a multi-trillion-dollar socialist rescue package.
It was a profound violation of the system's own stated rules. Profits had been aggressively privatized during the boom years, concentrated in the hands of a few. But the catastrophic risks and losses were fully socialized during the bust, placed on the shoulders of the taxpayers.
And the political anger generated by that hypocrisy is still burning today. The perception among the public was entirely clear and entirely accurate. The bankers whose criminal negligence caused the crash were rescued with public money, kept their bonuses, and faced zero criminal prosecutions. Meanwhile, millions of everyday working people lost their homes to foreclosure, lost their jobs, saw their retirement savings wiped out, and received absolutely zero help from the government.
The crisis of 2008 deeply and permanently eroded public trust in the institutions of capitalism, the governments that regulate it, and the technocratic experts who manage it. The financial machinery survived, but the social contract that legitimizes the system was deeply fractured. This perceived unfairness ignited a wave of anti-establishment populism, both on the left and the right, that has completely reshaped global politics over the last 15 years.
Which brings us right to the present moment, the final section of our deep dive. The crossroads. The sources indicate that modern capitalism, having barely survived 2008, is currently facing four unprecedented, overlapping stress tests. These are not just cyclical recessions or temporary panics. These are existential challenges to the underlying logic of the system itself. Let's walk through them carefully. Challenge number one, climate change.
This is perhaps the ultimate test of the system's viability. As we discussed earlier, the core, non-negotiable engine of capitalism is capital accumulation. It requires perpetual, compounding growth, more production, more consumption, year after year, forever.
Right.
But historically, that staggering growth has been powered by burning fossil fuels, generating the greenhouse gas emissions that are rapidly warming the planet and destabilizing the biosphere.
And the fundamental problem is that the market mechanism on its own is blind to this destruction. The sources use an economic term here, negative externalities.
A negative externality is a cost generated by a private business transaction that is forced onto a third party or onto society at large rather than being paid by the business itself.
Let's make that concrete. If I own a factory that makes cheap plastic toys, I pay for the raw plastic, I pay for the electricity, and I pay the wage of my workers. I factor those costs into the price of the toy. But to get the electricity, I am burning coal and pumping tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. The carbon emission is causing global temperatures to rise, which increases the severity of hurricanes, which destroys homes in coastal cities.
But you, the factory owner, do not pay for the hurricane damage. That cost is externalized. And because the market does not price in the true cost of the carbon emissions, the market produces vastly too much of it. The price signal is fundamentally flawed.
The price tag on the plastic toy is artificially cheap because it doesn't reflect the cost of the rising sea levels.
Exactly. It is the tragedy of the commons played out on a planetary scale. And the profound existential question is whether capitalism can be reformed to internalize these costs. Can we institute global carbon pricing, massive state regulations, and redirect the immense power of private capital toward building a green energy infrastructure? Or is an economic system that literally requires perpetual, infinite growth fundamentally, mathematically incompatible with a physical planet that has finite ecological limits? It is the most consequential question of our century.
Challenge number two, extreme inequality and the politics of resentment. We touched on this with the aftermath of 2008, but the dynamic is accelerating. We are seeing a concentration of wealth that rivals the era of kings and emperors.
The historical question here is whether the system can self-correct. During the Keynesian Golden Age, post-WWII, democratic capitalism proved it could regulate itself. Through high progressive taxation and strong labor laws, it redistributed wealth and built a stable middle class.
But the sources suggest the architecture of wealth has changed. Capital has become hyper-globalized, while labor and governments remain stubbornly local.
Precisely. Can modern Schrumpfscher democracies summon the political will to heavily tax billionaires and multinational corporations today? Or has capital become so mobile, so adept at hiding in offshore tax havens and pitting nations against each other that it can permanently evade regulation? Because if this extreme concentration of wealth cannot be curbed, the resulting political instability and resentment will tear democratic societies apart from the inside.
It feels like the shock absorbers have completely worn out and the passengers are violently turning on each other while the car careens down the road. Okay, challenge number three, platform capitalism. The rise of big tech. Google, Amazon, Meta, Apple. This feels like an entirely new mutation of the system.
It is a profound shift. We have entered an era dominated by digital technology platforms that operate on extreme network effects.
Network effects, meaning the service becomes exponentially more valuable precisely because everyone else is already using it. A social media network is entirely useless if you are the only user. A search engine gets better the more people search on it.
Right. And because of the nature of network effects, digital markets have a natural gravitational pull toward winner-take-all monopolies. There is no room for the second-best search engine. But what makes platform capitalism truly novel and challenging to traditional economic theory is the mechanism of value extraction. These tech platforms are among the wealthiest corporations in human history, but they generate massive economic value from the behavior, the interactions, and the data of users who are not paid a wage for their contributions.
This is a wild concept. You use the search engine or the social network for free. You don't pay money. But your attention, your clicks, your behavioral data, that is the raw material being mined, packaged, and sold to advertisers to predict and manipulate your future behavior. We are the unpaid labor force generating the data that builds their capital.
It is a new form of the enclosure movement. Just as early capitalists enclosed the physical commons of land, Big tech has enclosed the digital commons of human social interaction and information exchange.
And how does a government even begin to regulate that? The old antitrust laws from the 20th century were written to break up oil monopolies and railroad cartels that were using their dominance to artificially raise prices on consumers. But how do you prosecute a monopoly that charges the consumer $0? How do you regulate an algorithm that monopolizes human attention? We are trying to regulate a 21st century digital extraction machine using 19th century legal tools.
Governments and economists are only just beginning to develop the vocabulary to define the problem, let alone solve it.
Which brings us, finally, to challenge number 4. And honestly, this is the one that gives me the most vertigo. The meaning of work in the age of artificial intelligence and advanced automation.
We have seen automation disrupt the labor market for decades. Robots have steadily displaced blue-collar manufacturing jobs on assembly lines. But the emergence of generative AI threatens to displace cognitive, analytical, and creative work at a scale and speed that is completely unprecedented.
And this is where I had a massive systemic realization reading the sources. Let's trace this all the way back to the beginning. The fundamental definition of capitalism. Pillar 3 was wage labor. The entire system rests on the social contract that the vast majority of human beings survive by selling their physical or cognitive labor to capital owners in exchange for a wage. But if AI and advanced robotics cross a threshold where they permanently displace the need for human labor across vast swaths of the economy, if an algorithm can write code, draft legal briefs, diagnose diseases, and generate marketing copy vastly cheaper, faster, and better than a human, then the capital owners will logically stop hiring humans. They won't pay wages.
And if the capital owners do not pay wages, the working class has no income.
Exactly. This is the ultimate contradiction. If you eliminate the wage laborer, who is going to buy the endless stream of goods and services that the AI-driven corporations are producing? The entire consumption cycle collapses. If there is no wage labor and therefore no consumer purchasing power, does capitalism literally cease to exist by its own structural definition? Does the machine simply tear itself apart?
It is a profound, perhaps terminal paradox. If we achieve a state of hyperproductive automation that eliminates the necessity of human toil, it shatters the income distribution mechanism of capitalism. Many forward-thinking economists argue this will force society to transition to entirely new models, like a universal basic income where the state heavily taxes the immense productivity of AI and algorithms and simply distributes cash to the population to ensure survival and keep the consumption engine running.
But if the state is heavily taxing robot-generated wealth and handing it out as a universal allowance to citizens who don't work for it, is that even capitalism anymore?
That is the ultimate question. But what is truly fascinating here, and what the sources emphasize, is that the history of capitalism is essentially a history of crisis and mutation. It is not a static monolith. It constantly produces terrifying internal contradictions. Those contradictions provoke massive societal responses. And the system invariably emerges as something entirely new, yet structurally recognizable on the other side. The merchant capitalism of the 14th century Venetian spice traders was vastly different from the dark, soot-stained industrial capitalism of Victorian England, which was vastly different from the regulated Keynesian capitalism of the 1950s, which is entirely different from the algorithmic, hyper-financialized platform capitalism of today.
It operates like an incredibly resilient, highly adaptive virus. Every time you think it's about to be eradicated, it just updates its software and infects the host in a new way.
Exactly. The only absolute certainty we have is that the economic system we are operating under today will not be the system we have in 50 years. Whether the current cascade of challenges, the ecological limits of climate change, the destabilization of extreme inequality, the data monopolies of big tech, and the labor-destroying potential of AI produces another round of systemic modification, or whether it breaks the architecture so fundamentally that we need an entirely new word for it, is the great open question of our time.
Well, let's pull back and recap the sheer scale of this journey we've been on. We started by looking at the 4 pillars of private ownership, markets, wage labor, and accumulation. We watched 13th century Italian merchants invent the DNA of corporate tracking with double-entry bookkeeping. We walked through the brutal, dark origins of the enclosure movement, watching peasants forcibly ripped from their communal land to create a desperate labor pool. We saw the sheer, terrifying awe of the industrial productivity miracle and the visceral horror of the 5-year-old child labor that fueled it. We unpacked Karl Marx's mathematical critique of surplus value. We explored how the bloody sacrifices of the labor movement and the invention of the welfare state bolted shock absorbers onto the machine to save it from destroying itself. We saw the entire engine stall violently during the Great Depression, only to be jump-started by Keynesian deficit spending, leading to a golden age. We watched that golden age collapse into the stagflation of the 1970s, leading to a massive neoliberal restructuring that unleashed global wealth while hollowing out the domestic middle class. And we stared into the abyss of the 2008 financial crash, where the system survived only by breaking its own rules, leading us directly to the four existential cliffs of climate change, inequality, tech monopolies, and AI today.
It is a history that demands nuance. It is an architecture that has proved to be infinitely adaptable, devastatingly destructive, and unimaginably productive. It is the defining human experiment of the last 500 years.
Which brings me right back to where we started. Whether you are walking into that boardroom right now or swiping your card to pay for those groceries, you are an active participant in this massive, mutating historical experiment. Every transaction you make is a data point in this system. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a lingering, slightly unsettling thought. Something that wasn't explicitly answered in the historical texts, but naturally flows from everything we've dissected today. If capitalism's defining survival mechanism is its ability to constantly mutate through its own self-generated crises, what will historians in the year 2200 call the system we are transitioning into right now? When they look back at our specific era, this dizzying moment where AI is replacing human cognition, where tech platforms have enclosed our social lives, and where absolute ecological limits are forcing a reckoning with infinite growth, will they even recognize our future as capitalism at all? Or are we, right now, as we go about our daily lives, quietly living through the violent birth pangs of a brand new economic era, and we just don't have the vocabulary to describe it yet?
A profound and necessary question for us all to ponder as we navigate the coming decades.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the invisible architecture of your daily life, demand to know how the machinery works, and keep looking critically at the systems that shape our world. We'll see you next time.